more sensitive to certain realities. Some women have been physically unable to become mothers, and they've additionally been unable to adopt. And so Mother's Day can be kind of painful in that regard for some. Some moms just feel like they've blown it. And let's face it, some have. That's just one of the realities we live with. Some moms have lived through that worst fear that any of us moms or dads can imagine as parents, the loss of a child. And then there's some moms who have been so horrifically wronged, or maybe they've been abandoned by their children, or there's a division that runs through the family that creates a tension that just makes it difficult to even think about motherhood, let alone listen to a message on a Sunday morning about motherhood. And yet motherhood is so very, very important. It's important because it is a key part of the basic element, the basic building block of human society, the family. That's just the way God has designed things. In fact, that is the very reality that caused me to choose the sermon title that I chose for Mother's Day. If Mama ain't happy. No. That's right, I didn't even have to tell y'all to finish the sentence. You did it anyway. If Mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Because that is a recognition of the reality that with the certain challenges of motherhood, that when the key player is out, it's like going to the backup quarterback in a football game. God help me, I'm using a football analogy on Mother's Day. Hey, some moms like football, right, Jana? Amen, right? It's like going to the backup quarterback because the starting player is injured. There's still a chance of success. It doesn't mean the game is lost, but it means people are going to have to step up a little bit and work a little harder. And that we're going to have to rely on someone else. And so we honor and we thank our moms, the literal, the biological moms. We are grateful for their service. We're even grateful for those that have fallen down on the job, because we also offer that gratitude up with an understanding of God's grace and forgiveness. But we also do so with an acknowledgement and an affirmation of what I'm calling for this morning motherly leadership, those who have had to kind of stand in the gaps. You know, we've often said that about fathers, and I know I have preached many a sermon where I've encouraged fathers on Father's Day to stand in the gap, or encourage men to stand in the gap for those fathers who have been taken out of the play, so to speak. But the same is true for moms, for mothers. We need those backup players to come in and to stand in the gap. And that's not just because, we're trying to make certain people feel better or to be politically correct, but let's face it, not every mother is present in the lives of their children, and so we need appropriate motherly leadership to stand in those gaps. Sometimes we really need that backup quarterback. And often in the experience of serving in that role, sometimes a new leader develops who's going to do just fine in the starting leadership, right? Or in the starting lineup. Normally at this time of year, when we go to Mother's Day, I will go to the tried and true text, Proverbs 31, and talk about the Proverbs 31 mom and the blessings of that leadership. And that's a wonderful text, and I don't mean to diminish it in any way, but sometimes when a preacher gets to a certain time of year, and you don't want to just over and over again preach the same text. In fact, I'm grateful that we have 4 Gospels, so that when we get to Christmas and Easter, I get to kind of rotate through them. And so, I don't hit on the same text except for, once in a quadrennium. There's a new word for you. Methodists know it well. Once every 4 years. But, I started looking through the Bible for other examples of mothers. And I couldn't, the one that just automatically leaps to the top of the stack when you start doing that is Mary, the mother of Jesus. Can you imagine what the challenges of motherhood were like for her? First of all, the birth of her son was announced to her by an angel, and then announced to Joseph, because Joseph thought the most likely scenario had played out, which hadn't, about how Mary turned up pregnant without his involvement. And then I'm sure there was that whispering that happens because, as she's telling the story to others, they're probably going, oh yeah, you with child from the Holy Spirit, huh? Is that what the kids are calling it these days? Yeah. No, of course not. She was telling them the truth. But that's hard to believe. I mean, we don't want to be so gullible as to accept those sorts of stories all the time. Anyway, there was those challenges. But then, after he was born, she got to be the mom of literally, the most perfect child ever. I mean, a lot of us parents like to think our children are the perfect ones, but this one really was. Yeah, I saw some heads shaking out there, and it's like, yeah, we know our kids aren't really perfect because we have to deal with them at home. But Mary did have the perfect child. And I think that must have presented its own challenges. In some ways, I bet it was easier. I mean, I can imagine the conversation. Jesus, did you do your homework? Did you clean your room? Yes, my dear mother. I cleaned my room, and I cleaned my little brother James's room, and I also straightened up your things and Father's as well. You can just imagine, right? I'm bordering on sacrilegious, but I'm sorry. Forgive me, Lord. In some ways, it might have been easier, but in some ways, it was more challenging. Take, for example, where I was drawn to for our core reading for this morning, the second chapter of the Gospel according to Luke, 41st verse through the 52nd verse. And they had gone up to Jerusalem for the Passover, and they were heading back, and here's what's happened. Now, his parents, Jesus' parents, went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. And then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem, searching for him. And after 3 days, imagine that, moms and dads. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress." And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?" And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them, and he came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. Let me say that again. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. So, how many of you moms and dads, maybe I shouldn't ask this, but how many of you moms and dads have done that before, left a kid behind? I'm confessing it right now. I've done that before. And before I was a dad, I used to get so just outrageously angry when I'd hear the stories on the news of a parent leaving their child in the car, in a hot car. I couldn't understand how that could possibly happen. How in the world could you forget your own child? Maybe the reason I was so indignant about it, so angry about it, was because to that point my only experience was a child, and I couldn't imagine being left helpless in a car like that. But then I became a dad. And my kids will tell you I'm not the, well, I can be a little bit absent-minded from time to time. Okay? When you got a lot on your mind, there's a lot going on, sometimes you forget things. And my first experience with this was there were a couple of times I got in the car and drove to work and walked into the office or started to walk into the office and realized as I was getting my things out of the back, the kids were still right there strapped into their car seats when I was supposed to have taken them to preschool beforehand. That happened a couple of different times with the boys. I think I might have even done it with Claire once or twice too. And then there was this other instance, which was a little more serious, but thankfully it wasn't a hot car situation. I'm grateful that God has spared me from that. Because now I'm coming to understand that that would be possible. So now my heart breaks more. But the other situation was, I was shuttling kids back and forth to dance class in the afternoon, and Claire had dance class and Schaefer had dance class, and I was going to pick up one and drop off the other, and I keep mixing up which was which, and Schaefer has corrected me twice now, so I'm just going to say I was dropping off one and picking up the other. That's 2 out of 3 kids that needed to be shuttled back and forth to dance class. Well, the middle child, Seth, was not quite old enough yet to be left at home by himself. But regardless of that, I had somehow managed to do it. I got all the way out there to dance class and suddenly realized that Seth was not in the car with me to make the switch when I was switching Schaefer and Claire out. It was a busy morning. I was running late, and I thought, oh gosh, I hope he's okay. I had told him right before I left, it's time to go now. Get your shoes on. Let's get in the car. And then I got in the car and I left. So I returned home, and what Seth had done was he had just gone out into the yard looking for me, and the car was gone. And so he just stood there hollering out, "Dad! Dad!" And of course we have neighbors, and one of those neighbors was a friend of his from school. So she came over and kind of kept him calm until I got back. But of course she had no idea where I was either. And so she's hoping, I'm sure, that Seth's dad would show back up sometime soon. But I came back, and there he was, standing in the yard with his friend, Madeline, or we call her May, standing out in the yard with her shoes untied, just waiting for me to get back. And, I had lots of apologizing to do. That happens. But you see, this isn't that kind of a situation where Jesus disappeared. This wasn't an oversight by his parents. You could understand that for me, but this is a little bit different situation. They had gone up for this annual feast of the Passover from their local hometown, or where they were living. It wasn't really the place where Joseph was from, but they were living in Nazareth, and it wasn't by modern standards too terribly far away, but it was more than a day's journey away. And so if you're just going to make that trip by yourself on foot, you're going to be vulnerable. Vulnerable because of highway robbers, bandits, and the like. Or if there happen to be foreign soldiers on their way through raiding villages. That's the sort of thing that could have happened back then. So people traveled in greater numbers when they were making journeys like that. And since, all the faithful Jews from Nazareth were going to go up to Jerusalem to go do this, then they all went together. Made sense. Safety in numbers. It made the trip more enjoyable as you're walking along, talking with friends and family members, people you've grown up with, people you've lived with for a long time. And it also helped them share the burdens of journeying with great loads. Some of them had beast of burdens. Some of them probably couldn't afford them. So they shared the journey. Now they're coming back home. And as you know, when you're traveling in a group, people tend to group up within those groups according to their affinities and age groups. So I can imagine that Jesus was probably expected to be somewhere with the preteens and teenagers. He was 12 years old. So mom and dad are up with the other parents. Probably grandparents are in another little section of the group. And all of a sudden they realize, as they look at the teenagers and the preteens, Jesus ain't there. And they're a day's journey away, so they had to turn around and head back against the flow of traffic on their own. And then once they found him 3 days later, they had to travel back the rest of the way. So that's why they're indignant. Jesus, why have you made us search for you like this? And he responds with, well, I had to be in my Father. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Have that. He responds, of course I'm going to be in my Father's house. Don't you know that? I'm the Son of God, so I'm going to be... Anyway, so there's part of the challenge of dealing with the perfect child. But here's the interesting thing, and this is my first point for this morning when it comes to motherly leadership. Even Jesus had to accept motherly leadership. From his own mom, he had to accept her guidance and direction. I want to be careful here. I don't want to say that Jesus was sinning, because we recognize, and Scripture tells us, that he was the perfect, sinless Lamb of God. He wasn't sinning by being in the temple, having these discussions with the priests and the scribes. But a funny thing happens as we grow up. And it starts right at the very beginning. As soon as we're able to roll over and start crawling, we start finding where the boundaries are. And that continues until that time that we're out on our own. And at the age Jesus was at that time, 12 years old, there's new boundaries being found there. All kinds of boundaries. And it says there at the end of that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. There's a difference between knowing what the right thing or things are and knowing what the right timing is for the right things. That's the difference between knowledge and wisdom. So if Jesus grew in wisdom, I think this is one of those important places where we have to realize he was both fully human and fully divine, but there's that fully human part. Discovering where the boundaries were. Jesus was not sinning, but he accepted his mother's direction and leadership in the family. Why? Because that was the right thing to do. It was, as Jesus said, right for him to be about his Father's business, to be in his Father's house, but he also knew that it was right and perhaps wiser to accept the boundaries that his mother was drawing for him. Maybe they'd never had a chance to discuss that kind of a boundary before. And it says there, in verse 51, Luke 2, verse 51, and he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. It says they didn't fully understand what it was he'd said to him when he said, "Didn't you know I have to be in my Father's house?" They didn't fully get it. So here she is pondering, treasuring these things in her heart. And this is something we hear about Mary from time to time. She processes things internally. But, the word submission is kind of a tough word for us in Christianity in our current culture. Because we've come to think, unfortunately, that submission automatically means the person submitting is lower than the person to whom they're submitting, right? But that's not necessarily the case. We're talking about Jesus here. Submitting to his mother's authority. That could inspire a new verse for that song, "Mary, Did You Know?" That Christmas song. "Mary, did you know that when you kissed your boy, you kissed the face of God? Mary, did you know that these feet would someday walk on water?" You could write another verse and say something like, "Mary, did you know that this child you were setting boundaries for was going to break the boundaries of sin and death?" I probably should just stick to writing sermons. I'm not going to quit my day job just yet, so... But here's the second thing I want to say to y'all this morning. Motherly leadership isn't just for literal mothers or biological mothers. The example that I've put up on the screen before you this morning is the image of Mother Teresa, who, though she never had any biological children of her own because she had taken that vow of chastity and had honored it for her entire life so that she could be fully devoted to God, was perhaps a mother to thousands, maybe even millions in some ways. Now, here, as an adult, my mom is still alive, and I spend as much time with her as I can, but I'm separated by some geography. She's a few hours away by car, and so we don't always get to spend time together. I'm not going to get to spend time with Mom today. I'm going to call her on the phone, right? Y'all can say amen.
Yeah.
I'll be in trouble if I don't. But sometimes I seek out that motherly presence from other sources, and one just kind of natural one, and y'all may find this kind of stunning. You may not know this by looking, but Trudy is a few years older than I am. Pastor Trudy's just a few years older than I am. And here's the shock. Get this. You may not be able to tell by looking again, but she's old enough to be my mother. See, I've learned how to put that more diplomatically as the services have gone on today, because I got in a little bit of trouble when I was saying that, and she walked into the back of the room right then. I wanted to, she said later, she's like, "Just like a mom, I walk in at just the right moment, don't I?" But there have been times when I have sought that sort of kind of motherly guidance that most of us need at some point along our journeys. I've sought that advice from Trudy or from folks like Trudy, because she's nearby, she's available, And sometimes she offers the advice whether I've asked for it or not. I mean, I think maybe in some ways I remind her of her own son. I don't know. Yeah, that's right. It's her prerogative. And you know what? I accept that with gratitude. And she usually knows when she's kind of tempted to step over a little bit, because she'll start saying, well, you know, I'm using parental language. I'm like, well, that's okay. If you've ever taken a boundary class from Trudy, you know what I'm talking about. When she's talking about parental language, you ought to, you should, those sorts of things. But the truth of the matter is, I need that. I mean, my name tag, well, not this name tag, but one of my name tags says senior pastor, but that's in name only. I mean, I don't really have seniority of leadership, not only in terms of my age, but also in terms of experience here in this congregation. So I value and I treasure that kind of guidance, that kind of motherly leadership, that pastoral leadership as well. Thank you. The truth is, we all need that guidance from time to time, within appropriate boundaries. That we need those motherly leaders in our lives when our own mothers can't be present, or just aren't present, have maybe in some cases chosen not to be present, or they've departed from this earth too soon. Jesus wanted to make sure his own mother was taken care of in just that kind of a situation. That she was loved, that she was supported, and that she was provided for, that she had a place in a family when he would no longer be there, because as he was on the cross, by John's account, he takes care of one last final piece of business before he says, it is finished, and dies. And that is to make sure his mother was taken care of. Y'all ever notice that when reading the Gospel of John? John chapter 19, verses 25 through 27, it goes like this. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved, John referred to himself that way in the Gospel according to John, I'm not sure why, but the disciple whom he loved, standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And he wasn't talking about himself, he was indicating John. And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother," referring to Mary. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. Because he wanted to make sure Mary was taken care of. But let's face it, this assignment may not have been just for Mary's sake. I've already said that John is the one gospel writer who refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. I think he still needed a little bit of motherly guidance. I think he maybe needed some lessons in humbleness. I mean, I can only imagine those conversations later, right? Okay, John, I've read what you've written. You know he's Jesus, right? He loves everybody. I mean, sure, he was one of the inner three with Peter and James. But, you know, maybe he needed a lesson in humbleness, whatever the case may be. Moms and motherly leadership, even in adulthood for the rest of us, are in so many ways so valuable. They are also the unsung heroes of the family. It is often a thankless job. Moms work hard without receiving acknowledgement in many cases. They just do what they do because it's the job that they're supposed to do. They don't get paid for it. They just do it because they love. It's about sacrificial love, which is modeled after the image of Jesus, who gave himself up for us. And you know, often the fruit of good parenting isn't realized in the short term, but only years and years later. I cannot tell you how much grief I gave my own mother. There were probably many places along the way where she would never have imagined that I would grow up to be a pastor. And those are sermon examples for another day, so we'll just have to leave that where it is for right now. But the third thing that I want to say this morning is you never know how important you are because of that fact that very often that fruit is so delayed. Let me share an example with you. I want you to imagine for yourself a hardworking stay-at-home mom. And I mean, she was a really hardworking stay-at-home mom. We'll call her Sue. And here's why I say she's hardworking. She has 19 kids. And her last name's not Duggar, okay? She has 19 kids. And in the day and age when these kids were born, the infant mortality rates and child mortality rates were such that only 10 of them survived into adulthood. Just over 50% of her kids survived. So imagine the difficulty of raising that many kids and then also losing nearly half of them. Imagine what that life must have been like. Her husband, let's call him Sam, he traveled on business a lot. With 19 kids, he had to work hard to support them. And for her, it was tough to give them the individual attention and instruction they needed, but that education and spiritual development were so important to her that in addition to doing a great job of homeschooling all of them, she took turns each night. Each child would get a night. She would take turns with them to have individual spiritual conversation and prayer with them. Now, Sue's last name was Wesley. Her name is Susanna Wesley. She's the mother, and Samuel Wesley. They're the mother and father of John and Charles Wesley. John Wesley is the founder of the movement that then became some denominations, including the denomination in which we are now members, the United Methodist Church. Charles Wesley wrote literally thousands of hymns, many of which are the most familiar songs of Christian liturgy and Christian music in the English-speaking world today. Charles Wesley. And they can trace that back to her faithful and tireless dedication to their spiritual and their educational needs. If we go back a little farther into Christian history, to the times when the letters that became parts of the Bible were being written, Paul writes a letter, his second letter that we have, to Timothy. In chapter 1, verse 5 of the second letter to Timothy, Paul says, "I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well." I think probably Lois and Eunice had no idea the difference they were making in the life of their son for Eunice and grandson for Lois. What a difference they were making in raising their children and making sure that they learned the principles, that these children learned the principles of God's truth. They probably had no idea that they were giving instruction that was going to lay the groundwork for one of the pastors of the early church. We can't inherit faith. I can't just say my mom and dad are Christians, therefore I must be a follower of Jesus too. We all have to make our own decision in that regard. But when we're raising our children, we can do that groundwork. We can build a foundation. We can till up the soil of a heart so that the seeds of faith may be planted. We can create an environment in which there are fewer barriers to God's love, to God's grace, and to His truth. The main point for this morning is this: motherhood, and what I'm calling motherly leadership, are not something to be taken lightly. They're a sacred and significant trust. We must not count them lightly. Whether you're the one in that motherly leadership role, or whether you're the one who's being led by a mother or by someone in motherly leadership, it may be thankless for you moms at times. You may have to work hard without recognition, but please don't check out on us. The future depends upon your leadership. And for those of us who are following, who are being led, who are looking to moms for that leadership, don't check out on them either. Because just as the future depends on their leadership, it depends on our followership. Take care of each other. The love of a mother is ideally the kind of love that is modeled after the image of Christ. That we willingly give ourselves up. That we sacrifice. Jesus said, greater love has no one than this, than that He lay down His life for someone else, for His friends, He says, but for someone else. That doesn't just mean dying. Laying down your life means offering up your life as a living sacrifice. That's the model that Jesus lifted up, and that is, in its ideal, what motherhood is all about. Jesus himself made a sacrifice for all of us on the cross. And right after he made sure his mom was taken care of, he said, "It's finished." And what he meant is the debt was paid. His purpose was accomplished. He had saved us by his death. What a wonderful gift that is to us, and what a wonderful image and model it is that is so closely linked to motherhood at its best. So at the bottom of the worship outline this morning, I've posed a question for you. What are you going to do to make Mom's Day today? Now, hopefully, recognize the day is not, it's still young. The day is still young. About time to leave this place. So you still got the rest of the day left. So if you haven't taken care of that and made those plans, you still got time. By the way, bringing Mom to church wasn't enough, or consenting to go with her to church wasn't enough. You got to do something else. You got to show up today, okay? And if Mom's far away like mine is, you better get on the phone later. Wives, make sure your husbands do it, because that's what's going to have to happen with me, I'm sure. Remember to call Mom. Tell her how wonderful she is and what she's done for you. And maybe it's a situation where Mom's not available to you. You don't know where she is, or maybe you know that she's departed already. There's someone else. There's some other motherly leader whose day you can make today. Honor your mom by that gift. Honor God by that gift. Take care of each other.